Hello, I'm Justin Gable, the Director of Resource Planning at Southwestern Public Service Company, a subsidiary of Xcel Energy. Today, we're going to be talking about the Integrated Resource Plan that SPS is starting this year. Uh, this Integrated Resource Plan is a component of the New Mexico requirements around Integrated Resource Plans. And although it's a New Mexico specific requirement, SPS serves both customers in Texas and in New Mexico. So we really utilize this process to plan our system-wide needs, not just New Mexico or not just Texas. So we'll be running through some slides here, and the purpose of this recording is just to provide some background information to our stakeholders that are going to be participating in our stakeholder engagement meetings, to give us a little bit of primary information about what we are expecting, in the coming months as we're working together on determining SPS's future needs. So this is just some general background information. Like I was saying, the SPS service territory encompasses both Texas and New Mexico customers. On the left-hand side, you can see a map of our general service territory as represented in red. That service territory comprises 411,000 customers. SPS prides itself in its reliability metrics, and we currently serve customers with 99.9% electrical reliability. In general, the service territory covers around 80 municipalities in Texas and 16 in New Mexico. And those numbers don't include any of the unincorporated communities. So as we move into the slides here, we can go a little bit deeper into each individual jurisdiction. And by jurisdictions, I mean states. So this is New Mexico specifically. You see that 411,000 customers, 128,000 are in New Mexico. New Mexico's residential electric bills are currently around 17% below the national average. If you look at the map to the right, the red service territory indicates our area. Generally, it's the Carlsbad, Hobbs area. That's what we kind of call Southeast New Mexico, but it also includes areas like Roswell, Clovis, and Tucumcari. So we can move over from here and we can talk about our Texas region. In the Texas region, we generally talk about the Texas Panhandle, and that ranges down from south of Levelland all the way up as north as Borger or Dalhart. That service territory comprises about 283,000 customers. It similarly has a very high electrical reliability, and similar to New Mexico, the residential electric bills are around 19% below the national average. So as we move on from our service territory, we can talk about exactly what SPS does. And SPS does it all from the electrical system perspective. That includes everything over here from the left where it says power generation, and those can include our natural gas facilities or our solar facilities, wind facilities, battery storage, a number of different types of technology, hopefully in the future, maybe even some emerging technologies. Once that power is generated, it is conducted across our transmission system and ultimately finds its way to the substations, going to feeders and taps, all the way down to the transformers and service lines to individual homes. As we move further into the presentation material, there are a few key focuses that SPS has for the Integrated Resource Plan. One of the biggest one, I think that this is pretty standard across the entire country right now, is just increasing load. SPS has some specific opportunities in its service territory, a lot focused around the oil and gas industry, and the oil and gas industry specifically in the Permian Basin. What we've seen over the past few years is substantial load growth in oil and gas. And not only oil and gas for just production purposes, but also for electrification purposes as well. The SPS service territory with its low rates also is attracting very high energy use customers. And when we say high energy use customers, we're thinking of things like data centers or clean fuel producers, cryptocurrency miners. things like that. All of the increasing load that we're talking about in our system, though, has the opportunity for economic development for both New Mexico and Texas. And as we are, increasingly, adding resources to serve that load, it does present an opportunity for us to reduce carbon emissions in both our emissions footprint as well as other industries. So as we continue our conversation about increasing load, this map represents a little bit about the oil and gas industry. So you can see that over here in southeast New Mexico, this green area, that's our service territory. And you can see that it overlaps the Eddy County and Lee County areas. These areas, there's a lot of oil and gas development in the Permian Basin, which we have a significant amount of service territory overlap. So oil and gas is a huge driver of load growth, but another one is data centers. So you can see over here we've included a few statistics that are global in perspective. After globally consuming an estimated 460 terawatt hours in 2022, the data centers' total electrical consumption could reach even 1,000 terawatt hours this year alone. So what we're seeing is a lot of development in data centers across the United States, across the world, but we're also seeing those opportunities for growth in our own service territory. So we'll just keep on moving through, and we'll talk about our current customer mix. So these are what we previously were talking about were the low growth opportunities within our service territory, being oil and gas, data centers, other large load customers. But what does our current customer class look like? On the left-hand side, you can see our Texas and New Mexico sales by class. And class, you can think of those as either residential, small commercial and industrial customers, or large commercial industrial customers. Over here on the left-hand side, you can see, though, that large commercial and industrial customers comprise 62% of our total sales in the SPS territory. And if you include the small CNI, you can see that we have a significant amount of large CNI and small CNI load on our system. It's fairly unique to SPS as compared to the other utilities in the New Mexico state. On the right-hand side, you can also see, what does it look like for SPS to serve all of its customers on a jurisdictional basis. Currently, today, New Mexico comprises about 47% of our load, and Texas is the 50%. We do currently also have a small percentage of wholesale sales, which will be coming off our system this year. So this is not a system-wide perspective, but we can take this information and get a little bit more granular at the state level. And when we do that, you can see that trend continues. In fact, the proportions of large CNI and small CNI actually grow relative to the residential class in New Mexico. So we have an even large commercial and industrial base in New Mexico as compared to our system as a whole. And when we move on to our Texas area, you can see that those percentages shift slightly. We see a lot larger residential load and smaller percentages of large CNI. These are still very significant commercial and industrial areas for the SPS service territory, but you can see that there's some variation in customer class between the two different states. So just to compare ourselves a little bit to our counterparts in the state, SPS compared to El Paso or PNM, we can see that the industrial class really represents a majority of SPS's customer base, especially compared to the other two utilities who are much more either commercial or residential focused. You can also see that in the total peak production, SPS is looking at a 4,458 megawatt peak as compared to the low 2000s for both EP&E and P&M. Now, after describing our current customer base, let's talk a little bit about our current energy mixes. So this represents our resources that we have today in as of this number says 2024, but it really represents what we have today as well. We do have a large resource portfolio up for approval from our last integrated resource plan, but those are not coming online in 2025 or 2026. So these numbers are still fairly accurate. You can see that currently we have coal at 15%. This is represented by our Tolk facility, Tolk Unit 1, Tolk Unit 2. Combined is about 1,000 megawatts of coal. This is expected to roll off the system and retire in the winter of 2028, 2029 timeframe. As this coal comes off, it will ultimately be replaced with other resources across natural gas, wind, and solar. But how does this current energy mix relate to reducing emissions from our 2005 levels? So on the right hand side, you can see that since 2005, we've had a 52% reduction in total carbon dioxide emissions from our facilities. So we very much see that as a significant achievement, and one that we look to further. So now we've talked a little bit about the load side and the existing resources that we have on the system. Let's shift focus a little bit to what could be ultimately changing our capacity position. So one of the major focuses of the integrated resource plan is understanding how our capacity position is today and how it will change in the future. And by capacity position, we really are talking about the total amount of resources and those resources' ability to meet peak demand for our load that's coming on the system. And we can really think about the three factors that are changing that capacity position with these three items right here. The SPP planning reserve margins, and we'll get a little bit more in conversations over the coming months about what SPP is, but just real high level, SPP is the Southwest Power Pool that SPS, Southwestern Public Service Company, participates in on the market. What we have seen over the past couple of years is a planning reserve margin, which represents a margin of resources above what is needed to meet your peak demand, and that is a tool to ensure reliable service to our customers. What we are seeing is that current studies are indicating a need for a higher reserve margin in both the summer season and the winter season. In fact, what we see in the two different seasons is a reserve margin of around 16% today for our summer requirements, but the winter is actually becoming a much more focus for SPS because of the reserve margin, and that reserve margin is 36% today. So although we have a summer peaking region for our peak demand, the reserve margin requirements to help us be able to meet all of our customer needs through all periods of the year is really being driven by that winter reserve margin requirement of 36%. So in addition to our reserve margin increases, what we're seeing is the increased load. We've discussed that a little bit, but the other component is generation unit retirements. So what SPS is currently comprised of is a lot of aging facilities that we are looking to either potentially extend or PPA agreements, purchase power agreements that we're looking to extend or potentially replacing. So we'll get a little bit into that conversation now. All right, continuing on our conversation, talking a little bit about proactively planning for future energy needs. Now, we've already discussed a little bit of this. Electrical demand, expecting a 40% growth before 2030. After 2030, we're still expecting more load growth. We'll be working on developing load forecasts, and we're currently doing that right now. But every indication is pretty significant load growth in our service territory. In addition to the planning reserve margin requirements that we discussed briefly earlier, those numbers are likely to be going up. By 2029, we're probably going to be seeing a PRM in the winter increasing 2% from 36 to 38%, and the winter increasing 1% to 17%. There are a few things that in this IRP though that we think that can provide some pretty significant advantages as we're reviewing them. A couple of these are just replacing aging units or either prudently extending those or extending PPAs as well, something that we want to be considering. There's a number of retirements and expirations of PPAs within the 2030s that would be covered under this IRP. Some other components that we're looking at is the potential for reducing market cost or curtailment related to wind or solar facilities. Also making sure that we're maximizing any tax credits that still are available. There's obviously been a number of changes to tax policy related to wind and solar and battery storage resources, but we want to make sure and capture as much value as we can there with the current system that is in place. We also, one really interesting thing is the DC ties. Currently, the eastern and western interconnections across the United States is connected by 7 DC ties. Of the 7 DC ties that connect the two regions, 3 of those 7 are within the SPS territory. And those 3 connect SPS to both EP&E, P&M, and also our sister company, PSCO, the Public Service Company of Colorado. So all of these things are items that we think should be reviewed and considered as a part of this IRP process. So now taking a step back and just talking about the IRP timeline, I think it's important to kind of understand how this process works over time and how it relates to RFPs. You can see we're here at this very beginning stages of the IRP. You can see right here the 6-month facilitated stakeholder process. And these different colors, they represent a change in the year. So you can see all these different critical points in the timeline and then also the year changes. You can see that the IRP process is really a 4-year process between starting the facilitator stakeholder process, developing an IRP, developing an RFP that might result in resource selections, and then our final report of that, and then ultimately translating that from a selection to SPS seeking approval of those resources. So you can see there's a very lengthy timeline, over 4 years of potential time built into the IRP process. And it really requires you to kind of overlap these processes. You can see this is kind of what we're indicating right here is that as you're filing your CCN and your approval process in the regulatory realm, you need to be starting your IRP process for the next round right after that. So just in general, where are we currently at on this timeline? You see this top arrow, this golden arrow right here, this represents our 2023 IRP, and more specifically, our 24 and 25 RFPs. So the 24 RFP has had a resource selection. We have filed for approval of those resources. At the time that SPS issued its final report for those 24 RFP projects, it identified a need from 2030 to 2032 that needed to be solutioned. So we issued another RFP that we're currently in the middle of. So you can see that there's a little bit of overlap between our 24 and 25 RFPs and our 26 IRP process right now. So a lot of overlap that is currently needing to be considered in our IRP process. Now, I wanted to just take a step back and talk about SPS and Xcel Energy's participation in the regional transmission organization. The regional transmission organizations that are operating within the the United States are broken out down here below. You can see there's a number of them. SPS is right here in this black box in the middle of the country. And you can see it's colored red. There's a lot of other red states around it. The red represents the Southwest Power Pool. You can see that there's a little bit of overlap in some of these other regions, but we are squarely in the Eastern Interconnection in the Southwest Power Pool. So what does that mean? SPS, we're a member of the Southwest Power Pool. It is a regional transmission organization that is approved by FERC that oversees the bulk electric grid and wholesale power markets in the central United States. As a part of that, SPP also performs coordinated and transparent regional planning for more than 60,000 miles of high voltage transmission facilities in the SPP footprint. It constitutes an area of over 14 states. So by participating in SPP, there are a number of rules that SPS is beholden to ensure reliability. And what that means is that we ensure that we have sufficient resources to meet demand, or another word for demand is load. There's a historical emphasis on planning for resources to meet the peak demand. Generally, we call that like an LOLE study, a loss of load expectation study, and looking at a single hour in a year when the peak demand is the highest and our ability to meet that peak demand. What we have noticed over the past decades is a transition in resource mix, and we are bringing on more resources, or the general trend across the country is the addition of more intermittent resources, intermittent renewable resources specifically. When we say intermittent, what we mean is that the generation or the megawatt hours that are coming out of these resources are not dictated by our needs. They are driven more by weather. So those intermittent resources have a specific, what we call a production profile, that can follow weather patterns. When it's windy, there's more generation of wind facilities. When it's sunny, there's more generation of solar facilities, and the vice versa. In the nighttime, solar panels don't particularly operate, but we still have a demand that needs to be met at every single hour of the year. So as we're making that transition, we have to ensure that we have enough resources to be able to meet the demand when those resources are not able to meet the demand on their own. So we also want to make sure that as we're planning the system, that we're also planning it to have contingent resources that are above the peak demand. That is a requirement of the Southwest Power Pool to help meet our peak demand, that we have to have a certain amount of resources that are above that, so that as things happen, outages happen, or weather patterns, or things that may bring off resources, that there's a sufficient amount of extra resources to make sure that we can meet all of our peak demand. Generally, how we review SPS's ability to meet its peak demand is in a tool that we call our loads and resources table. So currently, we're displaying our loads and resources table as of today. Across the top line, you can see that there's a description of the different components in the table, and you can see at the top line we also see years. So the year 2026, our current year, going all the way out to 2032 in this look. Generally, on line one, what we have here is what we call total accredited capacity. Now, accredited capacity does not necessarily mean the same thing as nameplate capacity. As a part of SPP, or Southwest Power Pool's resource adequacy construct, they determine each resource type's ability to contribute an accredited capacity value. For a natural gas facility, a CT, a combustion turbine, we may see 90% of its nameplate value. So if it's a 100 megawatt unit, we may see 90 megawatts of that unit that can be counted towards meeting our obligation of firm load obligation. All resource types have a general range where they have an accredited capacity value. Generally, wind resources, we're talking in the 15 to 20%, maybe a little bit more, for its ability to contribute towards its firm load obligation. So that same 100 megawatts, if it was a wind facility, you may see 20 megawatts of accredited capacity for that resource. Similarly, solar. Solar is a very interesting resource type because we have quite a disparity between its ability to meet peak demand in both the summer and winter. In summer, we could see higher capacity values in the 60s or 70% range. In the winter, it could go down to 10%. There's a lot of variation in that resource type's ability to meet our peak demand based on both when that peak demand happens during the day and also how much sunlight is expected to happen during that season. So there's an inherent accredited capacity value for all resource types. Something we'll discuss much further. I imagine that this will be a point of interest for lots of folks on exactly how resource types are accredited in the SPP system. Line 2, you can see here is the firm load obligation. Firm load obligation, that just means your peak demand. So in this look right now, we're talking about our summer. So this is our summer peak. You can see the expected summer peak as of today is 4,543 megawatts. You can also see that as you move to the right, that peak demand gets very high, very significant as we move out in later years. Now, the total planning reserve margin is on line 3, and that is that PRM that we were talking about. In the summer, 16%, moving up to 17% by 2029. So this is the amount of megawatts that need to be secured over our firm peak load. So lines 2 and lines 3 are additive to create line 4, which is our capacity need. And then to find out our final resource position, we take line 1 and we subtract it. We subtract line 4 from line 1 to get 5. And you can see the red numbers here in parentheses indicate a short position, a period of time or an expectation that SPS does not have enough resources to meet both its firm load obligation and its planning reserve margin. This ultimately, this red values, to solution that, SPS has a number of opportunities. It could be demand response, it could be a short-term capacity purchase, it could be resource selection, ultimately from an RFP. So moving on, generation resources. So in 2030, what does our capacity look like by resource type? I'm sure people would take the time to pause on this video or just to review this information, but we had a little bit of a discussion about nameplate capacity versus accredited capacity. So you can see by 2030, we're expecting to have over 11,000 megawatts of nameplate capacity. That translates to 6,995 megawatts of accredited capacity. So you can see that there's depending upon your resource type, you're going to get much more accredited capacity versus your nameplate capacity. Just to look at a few different things here, you can see the gas, we got 2,317 megawatts of steam, and that translates to just over 2 gigawatts of accredited capacity. Now take those values and can kind of compare them to your solar here. You can see about half of the capacity value on the nameplate for accredited. So pretty significant differences between technology types on its accredited capacity value. Now on the right hand side, you can just see a general map by technology types across the SPS service territory. The red asterisks represent new projects that were part of the 24 RFP that we are currently seeking approval for. So you can see a range of different resources and across the area. A lot of wind resources throughout here. The blue indicating natural gas. Those are all across the system. All right, and now just to take a slightly different look at this, let's talk about our decreasing accredited capacity value. So a number of factors here, uh, aging and retiring, gas steam fleet. So we have a number of resources that are coming off during the 2030s, like you mentioned. A couple of examples is Nichols 1. That's a resource that represents about 106 megawatts, and it is coming off in the mid 2030s. So that is adding to our capacity need. Obviously, the retirement of Tolk coal plant and its current expectation to be replaced by resources from the 24 RFP. So as we are rolling off some of these natural gas and coal facilities, there is a need for firm and dispatchable resource capacity. That represents a much more capacity dense resource as compared to something like wind or solar. But you can see over here, general resource mixes through time. These numbers, they relate back to those tables that we were previously showing, but you can see that the wind resources, we have a significant amount of nameplate wind resources, but you can see that those values do get lower over time. And you can see SPS, as we're transitioning away from coal, you can see off by 2029, you can see a pretty significant increase in gas combustion turbines. So from 795 to now 2,699 in 2029. So another name for our firm load obligation and PRM requirement is our resource adequacy requirement. So this is what we have to, or what we need to solution, and then the black line represents the accredited resource capacity that we have to meet that. So if the red dashed line is above the black line, we are long, and if it is underneath, then it represents a deficiency in capacity to meet our firm load obligation. So increasing resource adequacy requirements. So the transition from traditional thermal resources to more intermittent resource types really has represented a change in the type of resources that we have on a nameplate versus accredited capacity. The ratio is shifting as we move further in time and add more intermittent resources. So that increases our need for more resources as we transition to more intermittent type resources. Another impactful thing to our resource adequacy requirements are things like the winter storm Uri events, things like that. Ultimately, drive up those PRM requirements in the winter, and require more resources to meet those peak demands. All right. Well, that is the end of our pre-read material. There is an appendices at the end of this presentation that you can also peruse. We hope that this was a good primer on SPS and what it is looking to target in the IRP discussions going forward. Look forward to having discussions with stakeholders about this material or any other questions that you may have that is in response to this information. But we thank you for your time and look forward to seeing you in the coming months.